You're a mess. That's basically why. You haven't got control over yourself at all. If we didn't have schools that are like the schools we have, we wouldn't have attention deficit disorder as a pathology. It's definitely overdiagnosed. Second, it's a very unreliable psychiatric diagnosis. Many psychiatric diagnoses are unreliable, and that's because psychiatric diagnoses aren't precisely scientific categories. They're weird hybrids, right? First of all, psychiatrists aren't scientists, they're engineers. Engineers are trying to do something rather than to describe the objective world, and psychiatrists are trying to make people healthy, whatever that means. It's actually partly ethical. It's very complicated. We don't know how to distinguish it from temperamental variation. So for example, if you're high in openness and high in extroversion, low in agreeableness, conscientiousness, and high in neuroticism, you're likely to manifest symptoms of ADHD. It's because you're exploratory, you don't like to sit down, you're full of ideas, your attention scatters across a wide variety of topics, and you're not very stable. Temperamental variation is also much more common among boys. Panksepp showed, same guy, with rats, that if you deprive young rats of rough and tumble play, which is what the young boys are deprived of in school, let's say, that they get hyperactive, then their prefrontal cortexes don't develop very well because they're not having the right kind of experiences, and that you can treat that quite effectively with psychomotor stimulants like Ritalin. There is also absolutely no evidence whatsoever that long-term use of psychomotor stimulants produces increases in cognitive gain. Zero. And there's plenty of evidence that it's harmful. Then the second part of that was, what about adjustments for, in the academic world, say? That would be disability adjustments. It's like, that's such a rat's nest that I don't want to even discuss it. There is a never-ending multiplication of disabilities. That's what's happening right now. The disability offices in the universities are swamped. Like, I know some people have it rough. Like, believe me, I know that. I seriously know that. I've dealt with extraordinarily damaged people in my life. You're bloody hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't have a serious problem, or who doesn't have a serious problem in a close family member. It's like, where do you draw the line with regards to disabilities? Well, you can't. You can't. They multiply. The way that you deal with it is you have objective standards. You apply them to everyone. Not because that's fair. It's not fair if your criteria for fairness is that everyone has the same outcome. It's not fair at all. It's not even close to fair. It's just less tyrannical than the alternatives. Your attention, for example, is mediated by unconscious forces. And you know that perfectly well. And this is another Freudian observation. You know, if you're sitting down to study, for example, your conscious intent is to study. But you know perfectly well that all sorts of distraction fantasies are going to enter the theater of your imagination non-stop and annoyingly. And there isn't really a lot you can do about that except maybe wait it out. You know, so you'll be sitting there reading and your attention will flicker away. You'll think about, I don't know, maybe you want to watch Jane the Virgin on Netflix or something like that, or maybe it's time to have a peanut butter sandwich, or you should get the dust bunnies out from underneath the bed, or it's time to go outside and have a cigarette, or maybe it's time for a cup of coffee, or it's like all these subsystems in you that would like something aren't very happy just to sit there while you read this thing that you're actually bored by, and so they pop up and try to take control of your perceptions and your actions non-stop. Maybe you think, well, this is a stupid course anyways, why do I have to read this damn paper, and what am I doing in university, and what's the point of life? It's like, you can really get going if you're trying to avoid doing your homework, and then you might think, well, what is it in you that's trying to avoid? Because after all, you took the damn course and you told yourself to sit down. Why don't you listen? Well, because you're a mess. That's basically why. You haven't got control over yourself at all. I also think that it was probably an idea that was more relevant during the mid to late stages, say, of the development of the Industrial Revolution, because to work in a factory meant something very different than to work as a peasant. First of all, if you were working in a factory, you became bound by time in a way that human beings had never been bound by time. You know, we time everything. Seconds mean something to modern people. You know, but it took a long time for the idea that time was of the essence for the organizing of human life. And a lot of that occurred as people moved into the factories. And so you can see, for example, the legacy of that in the modern elementary, in the modern pre-university school systems, because the school systems that most of you attended, with their rows of desks and their buzzers and their bells and their recesses, are basically factory structures that emerged from the Industrial Revolution that were characteristic of the way that working people who worked in factories organized their lives. So the bells that go off between periods and to announce that it's noon and to tell you that school's out, those are factory bells. And so you can see echoes of Freud's idea that the superego and the ego and the id are in conflict by imagining, for example, how difficult it is for a very active 6-year-old, especially if they're male, to sit quietly and regulate themselves by the bell for 6 or 7 hours, when they first go to grade 1. And the fact that, Freud would say, if he was alive, that the reason that so many people have attention deficit disorder is because the demands of the superego, so to speak, in the school system are so excessive that the clash produces pathology. Now, the pathology is obviously defined by the situation. If you define pathology as being unable to sit down and pay attention to things that are deadly boring while you should be running around playing and having fun and wearing yourself to a frazzle, then that's pathology. That's attention deficit disorder. And you can treat it with Ritalin, but that's only because you can treat anybody with Ritalin, as I'm sure many of you know. So, Ritalin is an amphetamine, and it makes you focus more on whatever you happen to be focused on, though there's no real evidence that it provides any boost in academic achievement over any reasonable amount of time. But if you think about it that way, you see, you can understand what Freud meant by this superego versus ego conflict, or the superego-ego-id conflict. Attention deficit disorder is a perfect example of that. And then the pathology is defined by the circumstance. If we didn't have schools that are like the schools we have, we wouldn't have attention deficit disorder as a pathology. Now, and people like to think about it as a scientific category. It's a disease, and a disease is like an objective entity. It's like, well, no, it's not a disease, and it's not an objective entity. It's a socio-cultural construction. However, there are certain people who are going to be more prone to be diagnosed with it than others, and that would mostly be extroverted, open extroverted kids, because they're not going to sit down and shut up because they can't. They're extremely curious, and mostly what they want to do is talk to everyone and play.